Hello and welcome to BCM241 Media Ethnographies. In this lecture, we're going to have a very brief overview of major historical developments in qualitative research and look at some of the key methodological issues associated with anthropological research, specifically those that contemporary ethnographic researchers need to be aware of. The origins of qualitative research and ethnography can be traced back to Herodotus, an ancient Greek scholar writing in the 5th century BCE, whose cross-cultural writings documented the origins and happenings of the Greco-Persian Wars. According to Erickson, the descriptive reporting of everyday practices became very popular during the Renaissance and the Baroque era, with a range of how-to publications, such as Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier and Arbor's Orchesography of Courtly Dancing, as well as Walton's The Complete Angler, Guide to Fishing, and Playford's The Division Violin on how to improvise in playing the violin. A common thread that we're going to follow this session is the idea of ethnography as content, and it's great to think of these kinds of proto-ethnographers as the YouTubers of the 16th and 17th century. Narrative descriptive reports were being written by Spanish invaders and colonial rulers in Latin America in the 16th century, and missionary workers in North America in the 17th century. By the mid-19th century, attempts were being made to define the foundation of a systematic conduct of social inquiry, resulting in the scientific study of society that Auguste Comte would call sociology. The work of early researchers who became known as anthropologists focused on ethnology, the comparative study of what it meant to be human, and the development of civilization. By the turn of the 20th century, anthropologists had begun to use the term ethnography for descriptive accounts of people who lived in colonial situations around the world and claimed these accounts were more accurate and comprehensive than the reports of travellers and colonial administrators. Organisations like the Royal Anthropological Society in England published manuals for the correct scientific collection of data during ethnographic observations and interviews in the field. Australia even had its own anthropological journal, as this image from the Trove collection of the National Library of Australia shows. As I noted last week, ethnography was devised from two Greek words. However, Erickson interprets differently, suggesting that the term comes from the word graphene, which is the verb to write, and ethnoi, a plural noun for the nations or others, which has significant connotations. As Erickson notes, for the ancient Greeks, the ethnoi were people who were not Greek, such as the Thracians, Persians, Egyptians, and so on, contrasting with the Ellenoi or the Hellenes, as us versus them. He argues that the Greeks were more than a little xenophobic, so that the ethnoi carries serious pejorative implications. This is an example of what's called othering, which simultaneously makes people not like yourself more familiar and more alien, as it is implied that these people are not like you and indeed defined by the difference to you. Othering is a common problem in the colonial-centric focus of anthropology and ethnography, which often sees an everyday account of the lives of newly made colonial subjects whose cultures and ways of life have been overthrown by the usually white European colonial powers. There were, however, important interventions in ethnographic history that sought to address such obvious abuses of power. Erickson attributes the monograph by W.E.B. Du Bois, titled The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, as a major turning point. Du Bois' study of African Americans combined demographic data, area maps, community histories, interviews, surveys of local institutions and community groups with descriptive accounts of daily life, with the express intent of making the lives of these people more visible and to give a voice to an important culture at a time when the white middle-class society dominated politics and academia in America. Describing the conduct of everyday life in ways that focus on the subjective orientation of experience and the meaning-making perspective of those who are being studied became the core focus of anthropological ethnography following the groundbreaking monographs of Bronislaw Malinowski and his study titled The Argonauts of the Western Pacific, published in 1922. As Erickson reports, and I'm quoting here, during World War I, Malinowski, a Pole who had studied anthropology in England, was interned by the British colonial authorities during his fieldwork in the Trobriand Islands of Melanesia, because they were concerned that, as a subject of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he might be a spy. He was not allowed to return home until after the war had ended. Malinowski later made a virtue of necessity and claimed that his 4 years of enforced fieldwork and knowledge of the local language enabled him to write a report that encompassed the system of everyday life in its entirety and accurately represented nuances of local meaning in its daily conduct. After Malinowski, this became a hallmark of ethnography in anthropology, reporting that included the meaning perspective of those whose daily actions were being described. End quote. Of course, these claims have been historically debunked and contested. Malinowski's approach became known as interpretively oriented realist ethnography and presumed that local meaning is causal in social life, and that local meaning varies fundamentally, albeit sometimes subtly, from one local setting to another. Another major anthropologist was Margaret Mead, whose 1928 study titled Coming of Age in Samoa prompted sociologists and social scientists to produce ethnographic studies of indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, including Australia, New Guinea, Micronesia, Melanesia, East, West, and South Africa. These studies were firmly grounded in the colonial ideological tradition, as Nasir Udin notes in your reading this week, which regarded the subjects of the inquiry as the uncivilized other. Anthropologists have long been criticized for ethnographies which view the researcher as the more civilized human at the center of the study. Ueden argues that the category of us or we imagines the researcher and their historically white audiences, while they frame the subject of the research, as an object of inquiry and therefore a lesser being. Uden argues that the historical approach to ethnography has contributed to the key problem of unequal power relations that result from the investigation, interpretation, and politics of representing colonized people. Generations of anthropologists from the Victorian era onward, argues Uden, used the established orthodoxies of ethnographic research to frame the people it studied as primitive, ancient, illiterate, often marveling in the nude exotic other, which contributed to the production of knowledge that helped to expand the colonial empires and consolidate their power. Information supplied by ethnographers did indeed help colonial empires to find ways to exert political domination and economic exploitation. Uden notes a similar problem in the dialectics of masculinity and femininity, and it was during the 1970s that the feminist movement made an important contribution to anthropology by challenging deeply held views regarding the complexities of male and female researchers, interpreting gender issues of different populations and cultures as complicated and partial. The key point here is that ethnographic researchers should not position themselves as the authority in a situation, but rather seek to overcome the problems of unequal power relations that exist in the situation and gives the researcher the authorial power over what is communicated by the research. A way to avoid this is not to make generalizations about your observations and your conclusions. Your voice is important, but it is not the definitive voice. It is one voice among many. This is one of the key skills of the ethnographer to realize, that your view is always partial and incomplete, and that no matter how much time you spend in your field site or how much you know about it, your view is your view, and another researcher working in the same field might come to an entirely different conclusion. That's the end of this part of the lecture. In the next part, we're going to focus more on developing these kinds of core skills of the contemporary ethnographer in ways that seek to avoid the historical traps of colonialist anthropology and othering.